what is the DNA of the value proposition that you're building? First, it's about remembering that it is not about understanding what your product, your service is going to do. It is about understanding what is the benefit that you're going to bring to your users, what is the problem that you're going to resolve for your users. First sub-dimension of the value proposition, the job to be done. What is the core problem that you are addressing? In order to illustrate that point, let me take an example. The example is about the parallel story of two products. On one side, the Newton, launched by Apple in 1991. It was a PDA, an electronic organizer. It was launched by Apple while John Sculley was the CEO. John Sculley, so you probably all know, is the guy who fired Steve Jobs out of Apple in the late 80s. By that time, Apple was anticipating on the erosion of the sales of the Macintosh line, so they were looking for growth opportunities. And they identified the PDA market as potentially carrying enough potential for keeping the sales to grow. They designed and launched the Newton in the early 90s. Sadly for them, the product actually never took off. It's one of the biggest failures probably in the history of Apple in terms of investment. Apple spent over $1 billion designing, marketing, launching the Newton. But the story is interesting when you realize that very soon after Apple removed the Newton from the market, another PDA came into the picture, the Palm Pilot. Launched initially by a startup. By the time they launched, Palm had been acquired by US Robotics. But initially, the product was designed by Palm as a startup. The parallel is interesting because nearly overnight, when the Palm hit the market, it became the bestseller in the history of consumer electronics. When you look at the two products aside next to each other, isn't there something that strikes you as it strikes me? It is the fact that both products are exactly the same thing. Both companies were working exactly on the same opportunity, targeting at the same users. Therefore, it's interesting to observe that one of these two products miserably failed, ironically the one designed by Apple, whose skill in designing and marketing such a product is well established. And another product from a startup became a world hit. The explanation of how from the same idea you can build so different trajectories brings us back to the notion of job to be done. Palm did something that no one else had done before. They talked to customers. They organized focus groups to understand exactly what was the core job that a PDA was supposed to do. And they understood something very interesting. They realized that there was a pattern. That pattern was very simple, that every former attempt of PDA, including the Newton from Apple, was always based on the same implicit assumption: it was a small computer, which technically it is. But that was the wrong referential. When talking to customers, Palm realized that people who were interested in PDAs were not looking for a small computer with a different form factor. They were looking for a viable alternative to their paper agenda. So, as trivial, as simple as it may look, the Palm Pilot was the first PDA designed to represent a viable alternative to the paper agenda, and overnight, it became a world hit after a series of continuous failed attempts. That is the notion of job to be done, understanding the core problem that you're resolving. Another very good example is listed in the related resources. It's an extract from a conference given by a very famous professor, Harvard professor Clayton Christensen, where he describes what they've done for McDonald's, who's trying to understand how to grow their sales of milkshake. And McDonald's had realized that by applying traditional marketing techniques, profiling the customers, asking customers to express preferences, by testing different types of milkshakes, none of this actually produced any measurable result. So Christensen convinced McDonald's to approach that question differently. Try to understand what is the core job that a milkshake is doing. So they stood up in a McDonald's from 5:30 a.m. during all day until it closes, and they noted down who was coming, stopping by, who was buying milkshake, what they were doing, consuming on site, or going away. And they realized something very interesting, that most of the sales of milkshake happened between 5:30 and 8 a.m. So they came back the second day, and they talked to the customer. They tried to confront the customers to understand why that very unexpected pattern was emerging. And by doing so, they realized something, that people were buying milkshake for one very simple thing, to keep them busy on their way to work. People in the US, many people in the US are driving 1 hour, 1.5 hours on the way to work. So they are actually they have to go through a very long and boring journey. And the core job that the milkshake was doing is just to keep them busy while they were driving on their way to work. When McDonald's understood that, the sales of milkshake increased by 30%. This is what the job to be done is all about.